Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be showing you the EditForm and DisplayForm controls in Power Apps. To begin with, if you add a DisplayForm control, the user can display all fields of a record or only the fields that you specify. If you add an EditForm control, the user can edit those fields, create a record, and save those changes to a data source. If you add a gallery control, you can configure it to show a table and a data source, and then configure a form to show whichever record the user selects in the gallery. You can also add one or more button controls that the user can select to save edits, cancel edits, and create a record. By using the controls together, you can create a complete solution. The form control has certain limitations. For example, you can't copy and paste forms into data cards. This is to prevent certain combinations of controls from being created that risk the stability and performance of the app. For either type of form, you set its data source property to a table of records, and you set the form's item property to show a specific record in that table. For example, you can set the item property of a form to the selected item property of the gallery control. When the user selects a record in the gallery, the same record appears in the form, except that the form can show more fields. If the user returns to the gallery and selects a different record, the selected item property of the gallery changes. This change updates the item property of the form, which then shows the newly selected record. You can also set a form's item property by using a drop-down control. Each form control contains one or more card controls. By setting the data field property of a card, you specify which field that card shows and other details. When an edit form control is in edit mode, the user can update the records that specified in the form's item property. If inspected, the mode property returns edit. When an edit form control is in new mode, however, the item property is ignored. The form doesn't show an existing record. Instead, the values in each field match the default values of the data source with which you configured the form. The new form function causes a form to switch to this mode. For example, you can set the text property of a button to show new and its onSelect property to a formula that includes the new form function. If the user selects that button, the form switches to new mode, so that the user can create a record starting with the known values. A form switches back to edit mode if either the reset form function runs or the submit form function runs successfully. You can set the text property of a button to show cancel and its onSelect property to a formula that includes reset form function. If the user selects that button, any changes in progress are discarded, and the values in the form once again match the default values of the data source. You can set the text property of a button to show saved changes, and its onSelect property to a formula that includes the submit form function. If the user selects that button and the data source is updated, the values in the form are reset to the default values of the data source. If you create a Save Changes button, as previously mentioned, the user can create or update a record and then select that button to save those changes to the data source. You could instead configure an image control or some other control to perform the same task, as long as you configure that control with the submit form function. In any case, the ErrorKind, onSuccess, and onFailure properties provide feedback on the outcome. When the submit form function runs, it first validates the data that the user wants to submit. If a required field doesn't contain a value, or another value doesn't conform to some other constraint, the ErrorKind properties are set, and the onFailure formula returns. You can configure the Save Changes button or other control so the user can select it, only if the data is valid. That is, if the valid property of the form is true. Note that the user must not only correct the problem, but also select the Save Changes button again, or discard the changes by selecting the Cancel button, as described earlier. This is to reset the error and ErrorKind properties. If the data passes validation, submit form sends it to the data source, which can take some time depending on network latency. If the submission succeeds, the error property is cleared. The ErrorKind property is set to ErrorKind.None, and the onSuccess formula runs. If the user created a record, that is, if the form was previously in new mode, the form is switched to edit mode so that the user can edit the newly created record or a different one. If the submission fails, the error property contains a user-friendly error message from the data source, explaining the problem. The ErrorKind property is set appropriately, depending on the issue, and the onFailure formula runs. Some data sources can detect when two people try to update the same record at the same time. In this case, ErrorKind is set to ErrorKind.Conflict, and the remedy is to refresh the data source with the other user's changes and reapply the change made by this user. By default, cards are placed in a single column for phone apps and 3 columns for tablet apps. You can specify how many columns a form has and whether cards should snap to them as you configure the form. These settings aren't exposed as properties because they're used only to set the X, Y, and width properties of the cards. Form controls have some key properties. For example, data source. This is the data source that contains the record that the user will show, edit, or create. If you don't set this property, the user can't show, edit, or create a record, and no additional metadata or validation is provided. Default mode. This is the initial mode of the form control. Display mode. The mode to use for data cards and controls within the form control. Error. A user-friendly error message to display for this form when the submit form function fails. This property applies only to the edit form control. This property changes only when the submit form, edit form, or reset form function runs. If no error occurs, this property is blank, and ErrorKind is set to ErrorKind.None. When possible, the error message returned will be in the user's language. Some error messages come from the data source directly and may not be in the user's language. ErrorKind. If an error occurs when submit form runs, this is the kind of error that occurred. This applies only to an edit form control. This property has the same enumeration as the errors function. An edit form control can return these values. Item. The record in the data source that the user will show or edit. LastSubmit. The last successfully submitted record, including any server-generated fields. This property applies only to the edit form control. If the data source automatically generates or calculates any fields, such as the ID field with a unique number, the LastSubmit property will have this new value after submit form successfully runs. The value of this property is available in the onSuccess formula. Mode. The control is in edit or new mode. Depending on the mode, different things will happen. For example, the form mode.edit. The user can edit a record by using the form. The value in the form's cards are pre-populated with the existing record for the user to change. If the submit form function runs successfully, an existing record is modified. Form mode.new. The user can create a record by using the form. The value in the form's controls are pre-populated with the defaults for the record of the data source. If the submit form function runs successfully, a record is created. Form mode.view. The user can view a record by using the form. The value in the form's controls are pre-populated with the defaults for a record of the data source. The form switches from new mode to edit mode when any of these changes occur. The form is successfully submitted, and a record is created. If the gallery is set to automatically move selection to this new record, the form will be in edit mode for the created record so that the user can make additional changes. The edit form function runs, the reset form function runs. For example, the user might select a cancel button that's been configured with this function. On failure. Actions to perform when a data operation has been unsuccessful. This property applies only to the edit form control. On reset. Actions to perform when an edit form control is reset. This property applies only to the edit form control. On success. Actions to perform when a data operation has been successful. This property applies only to the edit form control once again. Unsaved. True if the edit form control contains user changes that have not been saved. This property applies only to the edit form control. Also, use this property to warn the user before they lose any unsaved changes. To prevent the user from selecting a different record in a gallery control before saving changes to the current record, set the gallery's disable property to form.unsaved and likewise, disable refresh operations. Updates. The values to write back to the data source for a record loaded in the form control. This property applies only to the edit form control. Use this property to extract the field values from the cards within the control. You can then use these values to manually update the data source with a patch function call or another method exposed by a connection. You do not need to use this property if you are using the submit form function. Valid. Whether a card or edit form control contains valid entries ready to be submitted to the data source. This property applies only to the edit form control. A form control's valid property aggregates the valid properties of all the card controls in the form. A form's valid property is true only if the data in all the cards in that form is valid. Otherwise, the form's valid property is false. Thanks for watching my YouTube video. If you haven't already, check out some of the other tutorials on my channel.